Well, the East India Company had been given its position initially. The reason why you wanted to grant a monopoly to a company is the government itself didn't have the funds or the means or the political capital to do these things on their own. So if a bunch of merchants come to them and say, well, we'd like to explore trade with the East Indies, and since we're going to be putting in all the risk to do this, if we succeed, we'd like a monopoly on all future trade with this region, right? Because the whole thing could go pear-shaped and fall apart and collapse in their faces. If that happens, then the British government can kind of wash its hand of it and say, well, you tried. It wasn't us. It was a bunch of private merchants. And then if it succeeds, then it's going to pay off for that company forever. So in the 17th century, the English government said, all right, this seems like a fair bet to us. And so 170 years later, right, the East India Company is still a monopoly. It's become deeply imbricated with the British state in a number of ways. A number of members of parliament were stockholders in the East India Company. The East India Company was probably the second most important financial institution in the British Isles after the Bank of England itself. And so if it were to collapse, large sectors of the British economy might collapse with it. So and obviously the East India Company had been a source of tax revenue for the British government. You didn't want that to just go away. It had been a source of wealth in a variety of other ways because of the economic and commercial profits that the company had generated. So so really, the simplest way of explaining it is that by 1773, the British government believed that the East India Company was too big to fail. It couldn't, just as with the banks or the auto companies over the past few years, this was an instance where the British government really felt that it couldn't just allow the East India Company to collapse. It could try and tighten regulatory controls over the East India Company. It could say, well, you guys just can't be wild cowboys over in India anymore. We need to pull the reins in on you a little bit. But it couldn't just allow the entire thing to collapse. It was, at that time, the East India Company was thought to be too important. Over time, the East India Company will be made part of the British government. That is going to happen over the next few decades. But at that moment in 1773, the British government wasn't willing to completely absorb and nationalize the East India Company, but it also didn't feel able to let it collapse. The colonists believed that Parliament had no right to tax the American colonies because the American colonies didn't have any direct representation in Parliament. So this is what the phrase "no taxation without representation" means. It meant that if the American colonists have no right to vote for representatives in Parliament, then Parliament as a body had no right to tax, and some even thought that Parliament didn't have any right to legislate for the colonies either. Once the Americans make that decision, then it's not clear that the Americans belong in the British Empire at all. So not every American in 1773 was willing to go that far, but they're only a couple of years away from drawing that conclusion, right? The Americans voted for their own local legislature. Those guys, they voted for them. They were, elite white men at least were represented in those legislatures, and those local legislatures taxed the land and property of the American colonists. That struck them as fair. Parliament, sitting 3,000 miles away with no direct representation from America, maybe it was okay for Parliament to enact commercial legislation and say, well, no, you can't trade with the French during wartime. That struck them as a reasonable sort of law. But the idea that Parliament could directly say, you must give us 3 pennies for every pound of tea you import, that was something that struck the Americans as offensive, and it had struck them as offensive ever since the Stamp Act of 1765, which really would have been a very invasive tax on every legal document and newspaper and other printed material in the colonies. To them, the tea on tax, even if it was a small thing, even if one thing that I often remind people is that the Tea Act was going to make tea cheaper for Americans. It was actually going to have less of an impact on their pocketbook than you think. So it's not higher taxes and higher priced tea that the Americans are objecting to. It's actually just the principle, right? The idea that, well, all of a sudden we're being seduced into getting cheaper tea And once we accept the idea that, oh, we'll pay the tax so the tea is still cheaper, once they're seduced into that mindset, then Parliament will say, okay, great, the floodgates are open, let's tax every single thing the Americans buy from Great Britain. And so that kind of slippery slope argument was the reason why people like Samuel Adams were really trying to hold the line and say, no, we have to insist on this principle of no taxation without representation, or there'll be no end to the types of taxes that Parliament will want to levy on us. So again, right, it's not the idea of taxes themselves. It's not even the idea of imported goods being more expensive that's worrisome to them. It's the principle and the slippery slope and the dangers that were around the corner that really concerned the Americans. And it was their relationship with the British government that was at stake. Yes, the news of the destruction of the tea immediately spreads beyond Boston. Actually, a number of Americans regarded it very skeptically. They were worried. Benjamin Franklin over in London, George Washington in Virginia, they're like, whoa, a riot ending in property destruction? That's not the kind of thing that the American resistance is supposed to be about. Franklin even urges the town of Boston to pay the East India Company back for the tea that was destroyed. And he later changes his mind, and people end up rallying around and saying that the Tea Party was, this patriotic event that was preliminary to the American Revolution. But at the time, not everyone celebrated it. Plenty of people did. There were plenty of towns in Massachusetts who were corresponding with the Boston Committee of Correspondence who said, right on, we don't advocate violence, we don't advocate property destruction, but sometimes your back is to the wall, and it's pay now or pay later, and we're not saying you did the right thing, but sometimes people are forced into this sort of thing, and that's what happened. So yeah, the news does spread far and wide, and as you can see from the graphic images, the first two graphic images, it's seen as being this kind of global event. So yeah, no, it's not a secret that American newspapers all corresponded with one another and reprinted each other's items, and so the news items that first appear in the Massachusetts papers, they make their way to other colonies. Actually, the Boston Tea Party takes place on December 16th. The news gets to Philadelphia just in time for Christmas, and so they issue a special edition that says a Christmas box, or in other words, a Christmas present for us, is that the Bostonians have stood with the other colonists and resisted the landing of the tea. So there are some patriotic Americans, the Sons of Liberty, who are very excited by the news as well, even though some people were also worried and skeptical about it. There's a famous cartoon that shows the ladies of Edenton, North Carolina, refusing to drink tea as part of the boycotts of 1774. And there was later a satirical British print showing this, which seems to kind of suggest that that these ladies shouldn't have gotten together and made this declaration that they wouldn't drink tea, that this was inappropriate this was something inappropriate for women to do. So again, yes, during 1774, especially after the First Continental Congress meets in September of 1774, the idea of boycotting tea spreads all over the American continent. And so there are a number of what we might call tea parties. There actually are other instances of people destroying tea publicly that happen elsewhere in Massachusetts, that happen in New Jersey, that happen in New York, there's one in Maryland. And then there are also these meetings in which men and women, or just women, get together and say, we won't drink tea until the coercive acts are lifted, or until the Tea Act is lifted. This is a type of political protest. But because it's something as simple as, something as familiar as tea drinking, it's something that women feel that they can participate in as well. But again, this was something that misogynists disapproved of, and so you see satires, both printed and visual, arguing against this practice. And the answer is it's both, and it depends on your perspective. Groups like the Earth Liberation Front have said, well, in the past, right, have said, well, we can blow up SUVs as a protest against climate change. obviously this was thought to then be a criminal act. So the Tea Party in some ways might look like the same kind of thing. Yeah, nobody was hurt. Some people were hurt, but no one was killed as a result of this. But the equivalent of in today's dollars of between $1 and $2 million worth of property was destroyed. Is this the kind of behavior that we think people ought to be engaged in just because they don't like the laws? I don't think that that's something that we're always willing to accept. So I think that actually throughout American history, people have not only thought of it as a patriotic act. In fact, the first people to come forward about participating in the Boston Tea Party, as far as I can tell, don't really do so until 40 or 50 years later, when most of the men who had participated in the Tea Party were very old or dead. And so there's some evidence to suggest that some of the people who participated in the Boston Tea Party were kind of ashamed of what they had done, right? That this wasn't something to brag about, that this was something that they had done that was lawless, that was an act of property destruction. And because people in the 1820s and 1830s were still dressing up as Indians and rioting against local governments, it's not necessarily the type of behavior that Americans wanted to encourage. Now, look, the end result of it was the American Revolution, and that it has been a source of pride for Americans. But did the ends justify the means? That's something that Americans have actually been surprisingly ambivalent about, and they have not always been willing to kind of say, yes, the Boston Tea Party was an unalloyed act of heroism. It was something that all patriots ought to be willing to do in the name of liberty. I think that most people wouldn't be willing to follow that argument to its logical conclusion, although in American history there always have been people who have been willing to follow that argument to its logical conclusion. So I don't think there's a right answer to that question. What level of oppression would it take for that kind of act of vandalism to be seen as justified? I think that that's a question that people in various societies all over the world have asked themselves since the beginning of time.